College football nerds at it once again with another preview. It's LSU this time. Y'all been asking for it, and we wanted to let this one marinate a little bit. We reached out on Twitter and said, who wants to help us with our preview? And we snagged ourselves an LSU superfan who's been a great asset to the show in the comment section, which just goes to show you it pays off to give us your comments in the comment section and let us know what you think about a game or about a season preview. Like this time, you can tell us what you think LSU is going to do this season. Give us a final record if you want to. That guest host this time is Lamar Stevens. I'll put in the description where you can find him, which is on Twitter, but he does a lot of his talking in our videos, sometimes setting us straight, always keeping us on our toes. I want to remind y'all, please subscribe if you haven't already. We're going to get right into this. First question goes to you, Lamar. First of all, thanks for being on. Second of all, LSU, kind of the national talk is, first of all, they've got a lot of heat coming off of last season, which maybe wasn't up to expectations, but given, there's two sides to the perception. There's this overarching, like, they're going to be really good this year, but then there's these questions of they lost so much star power on defense that maybe the thing that held them together last year was that they were in defense and might not be there this year. Is the national kind of tenor on that maybe wrong, and that the defense might be better than people are expecting, even though they lost so many superstars?
I think it's kind of funny, actually, because around NFL draft time, there was also flack towards the LSU regime at Everon and the crew. Like, where are all the LSU NFL draft picks? I thought you guys were supposed to be NFLSU or whatever you like to call yourselves. And, those guys stayed. So they lost Greedy Williams, they lost Devin White, and they lost a free safety, John Battle. Returning in those places, you insert Derek Stingley, who is what Derek Stingley is at cornerback is similar to what Dylan Moses was coming out of high school. If you remember, Dylan Moses was, even in 8th grade, he looked like he was ready to play college football.
Yeah, sure do.
Too big for his size. Derek Stingley, as a 16-year-old, had a 42-inch vertical, ran a 4.30, and it was 6'1". At cornerback, I think he's going to be okay. And his dad was a pro. So he's been being coached. He's been bred for this, if you would. I like to quote a radio station. That's what they said. He's been bred for this. So he's replacing Greedy Williams. And then as far as the Devin White position goes, they return a lot of junior and senior linebackers, and they get the edge rusher back, Caleb on Chason, who's supposed to be another freak on the field, a guy that can possibly break the game, if you would. And, don't know what he can do yet. It's been a lot of hype. He had 1 sack in the Miami game, a lot of pressures. So, I'm definitely excited to see him play. He looks like the Terminator. He's built like something else, something I haven't seen before. Or maybe like a Leonard Floyd, so maybe I have seen it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Chason, and I'm going to follow up with just a quick follow-up question to you in that Josh and I were talking earlier this week that last year, I don't think people understand how much he meant to this team in terms of that dynamic from the pass rush standpoint, because they had the secondary, they had the second level, they had some good interior defensive linemen, but the pass rush is what they were really missing out. I told Josh earlier this week, I think LSU regular season probably goes 11-1 if Chason plays last year and doesn't get hurt. Do you think that's, like, I know you're a fan and you got a little bias, but do you think that's a real possibility last year? Like, did he mean that much to the defense?
Yeah, well, without Caleb on Chason, the LSU was left scrambling for pass rushers, and thank God for Devin White crashing up the middle all the time. And maybe the A&M game goes in a different way if Caleb on Chason's in the game. Okay,
Josh. So we call you the Grim Reaper all the time on this show, and you tend to be the Grim Reaper a lot of times with LSU. And the funny aside, and one of the reasons we had Lamar on this channel. We've joked with him in the comments, and we were actually joking before the show that we never get LSU right. When we pick them to win, they lose. When we pick them to lose, they win. So y'all take this episode with a grain of salt. But Josh, I think everybody on this call thinks, because we've talked about it, that the defense is going to be better than maybe people think, even with the losses that they had last year. Tell me some areas with LSU that if they don't have an 11-1, 10-2, maybe playoff type season, what's going to be the reasons why?
So making me be the bad guy again, but all right, I'll take it. Well, first, I do think that they are poised to be really good, and the reason for that is that the first string starters, defensively, maybe not as much offensively, but especially defensively, are very good. When you go down the roster, all the major holes they have seem to be filled. Tyler Shelvin is stepping up at nose tackle, which is mainly just going to let Glenn Logan and Brandon Fehoko move back to DN like they need. You got a loss at every level. Ed Alexander, Devin White, John Battle. They're all very good players, but everybody they've got around them are really good. I mean, LSU does recruit at a high level. And the thing is, when you have this few losses, it's not hard to find one really high-quality guy to slot in. I think the biggest issue for me when I look at LSU is I don't necessarily buy that the depth is fantastic. When you look at the defensive line, Farrell and Ika are sort of the next two guys up. I mean, Farrell had a pretty good year last year, 4 tackles for loss. It was 9th on the team, but not necessarily quite the same guy that maybe Logan is. Definitely not Rashard Lawrence. Ika, you have a guy that's coming in as a freshman, and you're hoping he's going to be able to contribute. The point with that is you've got what I see really is 4 game-ready players in LSU's defensive line. That's as many as most teams have, but not a lot past that. Similarly, at the linebacker position, I think you've got pretty good players in Phillips, Divinity, Queen, and Chason. What I don't know is if the other 4 guys that are behind them are necessarily as good. In fact, I'm not necessarily sold that there is any of those 4 guys that can really slot in for the 4 starters and really maintain the same level of play. What we've seen in the past couple of years from other teams in the conference, namely Alabama, who's had massive attrition at linebacker, is sometimes you do have multiple injuries at a given position. So if you ask the question of why LSU's not going to have a 10-2 or an 11-1 type year, to me it would probably be injury. I think they can take some injuries at corner. I think they can have some injuries at safety. Vincent and Joseph both have lots of experience. You've got Todd Harris backing up at safety. So they've got talent there, but the defensive line is thin. I think if they get in a game where they're getting run on a lot, that defensive line depth could be an issue. And I think it's worth noting, at times last year, LSU was not fantastic defensively against the run. It's not to say that they were bad by any means, but they did give up about 140 yards rushing. And when you look at their game log, they definitely had some bad days. Against Alabama, they gave up 7.6 yards per carry. Against Georgia, they gave up really not as much as you'd think, only about 3.7 yards per carry, but obviously in a winning effort. But like Texas A&M, 4.2 yards per carry. Even UCF was now they were depleted when they played UCF, but mostly in the secondary. I think something that was a little quiet. UCF had 4.3 yards per carry on the ground. Most of the game, LSU controlled it, but I think sometimes you saw the lack of depth come into play. And we've talked about this off and on our show. Sometimes teams have really good first strings, and Mississippi State the past few years has been kind of repeatedly like this, where the first string can stop anybody, and then the second string isn't anywhere near as good. And they've thrown this around sometimes on ESPN that once you hit the second or third first down in a sequence, the rate at which you would score against Mississippi State and the yards per play starts increasing dramatically. I think LSU might have a similar issue this year. I don't know that the depth is good enough for them to rotate really heavily when a team gets going. The upshot to that is I think in a lot of games you're going to see LSU just completely shut somebody down. And the shock could be when they get in a game where they're playing a team that's a little bit better offensively, right? Where they do actually have to give up some yardage. And I don't know if that's going to be a Florida or a Georgia or an Alabama or, what kind of team you end up facing and what level of play. Maybe you don't see it till an SEC championship game or a playoff if they make it that far. But there could be a game where suddenly defensive line falls down. And then beyond that, I think the last point I'll make is, maybe offensively, and I'll let it turn back to you. I think the offense may take a step forward, but I think we have to be a little careful to couch that, right? That they can take a step forward and be pretty good, and that's enough to offset what should be a very good defense. But we don't need to be too extreme with it to think that they're going to take a step forward to be necessarily an elite offense, given where they were last year. That might be a little much, so they might struggle in shootouts.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going, because honestly, even with there's some depth concerns for LSU. I think defensively they're always going to be good. I mean, Dave Aranda is going to field an awesome defense, and there are legitimate superstars on this defense that people have either forgotten about or don't know about, and so I think they're going to be okay there. I've got concerns with Ensminger as a coordinator and running back depth, or even not having that superstar running back that has been able to carry the water a little bit for them, given that they haven't had an elite or really, really good quarterback to sort of offset the offense or drive the offense forward. So, Lamar, let me ask you this. I don't want to talk about Texas too much, so we're going to do a Texas preview. But looking at the schedule and thinking about just in context of the offense, there may not be but one or two games all year that if the defense is solid, the offense is even going to have to perform. Is there any game on this schedule, you can say Texas, or any other game on the schedule, where you think that LSU might need to score 35 to win the game, or is the defense so good that they won't have anything like that?
Okay, well, let me say this. You mentioned quarterback play, and you mentioned Ensminger. And I just wanted to say briefly, as far as quarterback play goes, we can't talk about how good or how bad an LSU quarterback is unless we look back at where they were in the past with Anthony Jennings, Brandon Harris, and Danny Etley. And when you see what those guys brought to the table, and you look at what Joe Burrow is bringing to the table, you could definitely see like why we LSU fans are so excited. The quarterbacks I mentioned just a second ago, two of them were no-threat quarterbacks, and I coined that phrase because no one else did. I don't know why. I was waiting for it. They were brought in as dual-threat quarterbacks. They replaced them to a pro-style offense, and then they became no-threat quarterbacks. And then Danny Etley was a shepherd quarterback, game manager, but more of a shepherd game manager, if you would, where he's a good leader and maybe keeps team morale up, but he just does not attack the defense. He will not pull the trigger. From what I see from Joe Burrow, if you are not buttoned up on defense, it's likely that he'll see it and he will attempt to attack it. And that's refreshing because LSU has weapons on the outside and they, got decent running backs. And it'd be great if somebody were able to use them. All right, so that's that. The Ensminger comment, Steve Ensminger and his relationship with Joe Brady, I kind of see it as I look at it like if I were portraying like a fighter pilot and a backseater, the guy behind the fighter pilot. So Steve Ensminger is going to be calling the plays, calling the game. And Joe Brady, who hasn't called a game yet, hasn't called any plays in a big college football game. He's not going to be pulling the plays say, hey, Steve, call this. I'm sure he'll have some input, but he's definitely tweaking the playbook and trying to figure out hey, why does this not work? This should work. What are you guys doing wrong? And he's been doing that to the playbook, a lot. So that's where I see that relationship going as far as the offensive coordinator and Joe Brady. They kind of need each other. All right, so to answer your question, I look at the A&M game maybe because I have so much respect for Jimbo Fisher and just how well he can scheme an offense into some success. I don't think the Florida game, which is the game I'm most afraid of actually, is a game that a lot of points are going to need to be scored in. But Dan Mullen is just so diabolical that I just fear that he can find a way to get you where you're vulnerable. So
sure.
I'm most afraid of the Florida game. Just what that team has at the receiver, and they just always seem to play a close game, tough game against LSU. And Jimbo, his first year in the SEC, he beats LSU. It hasn't been done yet since A&M's been in the SEC. So, yeah.
It's funny. It may be just because you LSU fans are still a little bit worn out from that game with A&M last year and all those points. But I think if LSU is healthy going into that game, it's not going to be sort of the crazy shootout concern that that it's been in the past, especially given the fact that I think A&M is going to be absolutely battered coming into that game, given it's the last game of the season, and they've got the second hardest schedule in the country. If I'm worried about a game, it might be Auburn, which is weird because, LSU had, they got a huge win last year against Auburn, and it was kind of where Joe Burrow got his feet wet. But Auburn that's always a crazy game. Alabama's right after that. Obviously, I think, they get a bye to rest and everything. Josh, tell me this. We talk about teams that have a good enough schedule to maybe get in the playoffs with a loss or not winning their division or not winning their conference. If LSU plays a knockdown, drag-out, close loss game in Tuscaloosa, but runs the table the rest of the way, and I know this is all dependent upon what everybody else does, but is that the kind of resume for them to be the 2011 Alabama team and make it to the playoffs and get to kind of rest while Alabama's getting beat up in the SEC championship game and make a run in the playoffs? Would they have that resume given the fact that they got Texas on their schedule and the SEC West?
We mentioned this in another show when we were doing a podcast with Buckeye Grove, right? That I think it is a possibility. And I think there's a parallel to 2011 actually with LSU rather than Alabama in that discussion. And that year LSU played Oregon, and Oregon ends up doing very well in the Pac-12. And that was one of the big things that caused the rematch to happen. It wasn't. It's an interplay between how you do in your own schedule, but also who you play within your schedule and how everybody else does. In LSU's case, playing Texas, and if they're able to beat Texas, that will have no direct effect on Texas's ability to win the Big 12, right? It's a non-conference game. If Texas goes around and turns around and wins the Big 12, I don't think that in that case, 12-1 Texas is going to be slotted in over an 11-1 LSU, even though Texas wins the conference title because LSU beat them. They have the same number of losses. LSU, it's probably going to have a better resume at that point. I mean, they're going to have the Texas win on their bracket, so they probably still have a top 10 win from that. Let's say Texas has a win over Oklahoma, and then by and large the SEC is harder than the Big 12. So at that point, you just start having to count your chickens, right? How many other teams can end up slotted in? You can have the Pac-12, you can have the ACC, you can have the Big 10, and you can have Notre Dame. Well, I guess, SEC, right? So you got all your conferences, right? You got your Power 5 conferences. You've already knocked out the Big 12, so now you're down to 4. The Pac-12, Oregon could actually be taken care of immediately by Auburn, which could cause major issues. USC has a lot of non-conference games. It's going to be unlikely for the Pac-12 champion to have a few number of losses, which has been the case in recent years. So let's say the Pac-12 is more likely than not going to have a contender. Quite likely you get Clemson in one of those slots, and at that point you're just talking about Notre Dame and the Big Ten. Now, Notre Dame plays Georgia, so if Georgia can take care of business for you and beat Notre Dame, then they're going to knock Notre Dame probably out of that conversation because they don't have a conference title. And at that point, you're just looking at the Big Ten winner. Well, if it's Clemson and the Big Ten winner and the SEC winner, let's say it's Alabama, and Alabama beats Georgia, who beat Notre Dame, I think it's LSU. If they've beaten Texas and they've gone 11-1 and Texas has won the Big 12 and otherwise gone undefeated, or if they've lost a game and win the Big 12, I think in that scenario it's going to be LSU. So this year I think is primed for a year where you could end up with two teams in the playoff from the SEC. I think you have to give the SEC credit, and if that happens, let's be clear, it's going to happen because the SEC beats Oregon, they beat Texas, they beat Notre Dame. They've shown that they're better than the top independent. They're shown that they're better maybe than the top team in the Big 12, maybe the top team in the Pac-12. If they do that, then they deserve to get two teams in the playoff because they've knocked off effectively 3 conferences, and there's only so many slots. So, yeah, at that point, it's actually going to be almost a little clear-cut in my mind that the team that doesn't win the conference or play for the conference probably ought to go in the playoff over somebody that does win their other conference.
Yeah, the inverse is also true, though, that if let's say LSU does beat Texas, but Georgia doesn't handle their business and Auburn doesn't handle their business, then they're kind of hoping for other things to go south for other conferences, which is, that's kind of the fun of it. I do think it's funny, and I'm not going to go on a rant because I don't think we have time, but what I think will happen, the narrative will change, and I always roll my eyes at this, is somebody will say, well, yeah, LSU beat Texas in week 2. Or Auburn beat Oregon in week 1. I hate that so much because it's like week 2, y'all, was like 2.5 months ago. Like, come on, it's 3 months ago. I mean, it's when you're most healthy. You don't get to discount a win in a 12-game season because it happened a month prior. It's totally ridiculous to me, but that's what's going to happen.
People do it both ways too.
Yeah,
it goes both ways. They'll be at the end. They'll say at the end of the season, "Well, we had a bunch of injuries."
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't beat them early. You can't beat them late.
Well, and the other thing we talk about a lot on the show is sometimes we get really suckered into evaluating teams relative to their own conference, right? So, what was it, a couple years ago? Was it I can't remember if it was the ACC or maybe it's the Big Ten West. One of the divisions just got pummeled in non-conference play early. And then you had a couple teams come out of that division with, one loss. And all of a sudden, we rank those teams pretty high. Okay, I mean, we already knew everybody in the division was bad. And we talk about all the time, a conference goes 500 against itself. And, maybe some teams go 7-1 and some teams go 1-7, or maybe they all go 4-4 against each other. But that just tells you whether teams are better than each other relative in the conference, right? How much parity was in the conference. It doesn't tell you whether the conference is good. And just because, let's say, Oregon loses to Auburn, who may not be particularly good this year, we don't really know yet, and then they go run the slate with the rest of the Pac-12, well, depending on how the Pac-12 does, if you throw away that Oregon-Auburn game, you're just going to be, especially with a 9-game conference schedule, right? You're really just looking at how Oregon is relative to the rest of the Pac-12, and you absolutely positively can't throw away that data point. But also to your point, Daniel, if Notre Dame beats Georgia, if Oregon beats Auburn, it's really bad for LSU in a lot of these scenarios. And, a lot of times SEC fans don't really root for other SEC teams. But I think if you're an SEC fan, you need to root for your opponents in these games, because if you're LSU, it's really good for you for Auburn to beat Oregon, and it's really good for you for Georgia to beat Notre Dame, because otherwise, at the end of the season, Notre Dame's going to be able to turn around and say, hey, we already showed that we can beat the SEC. We beat Georgia early, and Georgia was a pretty good team in conference play. You've got no reason to think we can't beat LSU or beat Alabama. Where, the same thing can happen with Oregon. Even if, let's say, Auburn finishes 4th or 5th in the West, Oregon's still going to have that argument. So that's why it's going to be more important than normal for the SEC to win these games for everybody within the conference, because it's all going to have a ripple effect.
And that's why I've been saying it's not about expanding the playoffs. It's about everybody going on an 8-game conference schedule and mandating 2 out-of-conference Power 5 games for everybody. That way we get as much, cross-conference play data points as possible, and you don't get to go back into your own conference, circle the wagons, and play against one another's relative strengths and weaknesses, and we rank somebody really high because they beat somebody who's got a good name inside a conference. Let's get as many data points as we can, and then we don't have to play the subjective game at the end of the year. And then we don't have to ruin the sport by expanding it to 8. That's right. It would ruin the sport. All right, Lamar, real quick, I usually ask this question early in the season, and I think it fits here. If LSU is in the playoffs at the end of the year, what's the one thing that actually that happened that maybe we're not thinking about, or maybe we are, to get them there? And if they don't make it, and let's say they have a 9-3 type season or 8-4 type season, what will be the thing that didn't happen or that happened badly to them that got them to that point?
If they are in the playoffs, they didn't sustain that many injuries. The O-line played better, especially on the tackles, which I kind of expect. I don't expect them to be a lot better, but the way the offense is supposed to be is get the ball out faster so the line doesn't have to block as long. And hopefully the line starts blocking better. So, the two work with each other to help Joe Burrow. And the other teams in the conference, their problems end up actually being problems, like, having a first-year quarterback at Auburn and A&M, like losing a bunch of their defense. Those things, if those things actually hurt those teams, then yeah, LSU should, Texas losing a lot of their defense. LSU should have a better time winning. Now, if LSU doesn't make the playoffs, again, like they had some injuries, the whole line played bad. Joe Burrow is getting sacked all the time. That LSU offense that everyone's hoping for this year doesn't come to fruition. It's the same old. We're running the ball with freshman running backs, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's a good running back, but not bell cow. And if it goes like that, they can lose anywhere between 2 to 4 games, I see.
All right, Josh, why don't you get us started? We're all three. That's right, Lamar, I'm going to put you on the spot. We're all three going to do our predictions. So give me what you think, not postseason, but what you think LSU's record's going to be regular season given this schedule.
Okay, first, I'll give one more sort of negative, and we touched on it, and we kind of got away from it. So, yeah, I know, I'm the Grim Reaper, but I'm actually just trying to get around to a point we were making earlier. It's what Lamar just said. The offensive line is the biggest key to me with LSU. And last year, very quietly, LSU was 91st in the country in yards per carry. For a team that prides itself on running the ball, they did not run the ball very well. Now, they ran the ball a lot. I mean, they ran the ball for almost 600 times in the season, but they just weren't effective. And moreover, when they were in their big games, they frequently got shut down. I mean, 0.48 yards per carry against Alabama, 2.5 yards per carry on 44 carries against Mississippi State, 2.88 yards per carry against Auburn. Even UCF, they were only actually at 3.1 yards per carry. So the biggest thing for me with LSU, if they want to take a step forward, is going to be, all this talk about the RPO and bringing up the passing game. The passing game was okay last year. Maybe it wasn't a world beater, but it was solid. And in a lot of cases, like the Auburn game, it actually bailed them out. Where they really need to improve is by running the ball. And Emery's a really good back. We don't know how he's going to turn out as a freshman, but the bigger deal was that the offensive line was not getting anywhere near enough push. All that said, it plays into the season, right? I mean, I have to assume with the line coming back, they're probably going to be better, but usually when you have the same players coming back again, they're usually not that much better. Usually things have gotten better when returning starters are bumped by somebody younger, or, even sometimes when you have turnover. But the best teams generally is when I see, and this is going to be the case with Texas A&M. We talked about a couple, especially in the secondary. They've got returning starters that will not start this year. That's a good sign. Teams with really good fronts, or at least enough talent to be good on the fronts, may give LSU some issues. Now, there are a couple teams in particular, Auburn and Alabama, that have the talent on the front line. You mentioned Florida. Florida has pretty good talent. I mean, they have some losses. Texas has a ton of losses. A&M's front seven is being pretty much completely retooled, so we don't know what they have really yet. I think it's going to be, of that list, I'm going to say probably they lose at least probably 2. And the Alabama game is one that, until proven otherwise, I think from a predictive standpoint, more likely than not, they probably drop that game. Alabama and Clemson still really through this year are kind of at a very, very high level that's going to be hard to touch. Not a normal year kind of teams, either one of them. You can be what would be a national title team in other years and probably still lose to Alabama this upcoming year, who, quite frankly, and we haven't gotten into it yet, stands a good chance to actually be better than they were last season. Auburn is an interesting one to me because I think Auburn is a tough matchup for LSU. Auburn is going to have one of, if not the best front in college football this season. Tremendous amount of experience. They were a very good front last year. They lose some at linebacker, so we don't know how that plays out. But LSU may really struggle to hold the line of scrimmage, which in the RPO scheme especially, that can really have a hard time. Is when you run the RPO, you're not really drive blocking. So if you get pushed backwards continually, and especially if the other team can play the RPO straight up where they drop the safeties back, which is what Clemson did to Alabama in the national title game, and they can give up not just enough yardage not to break against the run game, the RPO can kind of shut down. So I think the Auburn game is a tough one. Now, I don't know that I would necessarily pick them to lose to Auburn. I just think it's the most likely. I think Florida, A&M, and Texas are all equally sort of likely trouble spots. I will say I think if they lose to Texas, then the season, quickly you start moving from one loss down to maybe more like 3 loss being likely. Off the cuff, without having really done our deep dive and without having seen the teams, I think they're more likely than not beat Texas at this point. But again, if you got an 80% or an 85% chance to beat 4 individual teams and you play them all in a row, you got about a 70% chance of dropping at least one of those games, and that's where I think LSU is.
All right, Lamar, how about you?
I want to talk about that Alabama game. You asked me earlier which team, am I afraid of the most on the schedule? And I didn't say Alabama, and I didn't say it because I'm numb to it now. And I kind of just forgot about them. I was like, well, of course we're going to lose to Bama. I mean, why do you even say that?
Well, the question though was which team are they going to have to come up with 35 points to beat? Because
Alabama.
Yeah, I'm not, and I'll give my predictions in a second. But this is funny. Like, I'm not necessarily chalking that Alabama game up for Alabama this time around. So, but continue.
Okay, so the offensive line is definitely the key here. I don't see the offensive line so much as a unit that gets pushed back. I think they were really unorganized because they had so many different organizations. They had a guy down, the guy suspended here, or they had a lot of different rearrangements of that offensive line. They had a true freshman playing at left guard. Those guys are big. I like the left tackle. I like Sadiq Charles. I think he's pretty athletic. I like the center. I like the right guard. They're big guys. They're not going to get pushed back. But they have to work as a unit. If they don't work as a unit, and I'm thinking about the right tackle. If we don't get right tackle nailed down, then you're going to start trying to compensate with that, and the protection will break down anyway, even though the other guys are good. So that being said, I think I like 11-1. I like it for a few reasons. One reason is that Florida beat LSU last year, and that A&M beat LSU last year, and LSU tends not to lose to teams they lost to the year before. Last time they did it was Arkansas, maybe back in 2012 or something like that, or 2013. They lost back-to-back to them. No, it was Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette was in that game. All right, so yeah, 2015 and 2014, they lost to Arkansas back-to-back. But normally it doesn't happen. And both of those games are going to be in Baton Rouge also. I like them against Mississippi State just because I didn't believe in Mississippi State last year. And from what they're losing in Jeffrey Simmons and Montez Sweat, I think we'll be all right there. I like them against Texas just because of how much Texas lost. And, just Alabama really. Alabama, maybe coin flip, but weighted coin flip. So like most of the time it's going to land heads for Alabama. But, I like to dream. Maybe it happens. And I think they can get everybody else. I'm worried about the Florida game. It's in Baton Rouge this time. And I just feel like Dan Mullen, he finds a way. He finds a way to make offense, whether it's a weird option. I actually went to the Florida game. And, whether it's a weird option play that works a funny-looking way, or he's just really good at scheming plays open and getting his athletes in space.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, right? I mean, when you say one loss, maybe you think LSU is like a 60-40 game against Alabama. But again, the problem is if you get a 15% chance to lose 2 or 3 other games, then all of a sudden it's a really high chance you lose one. And that's where we're at when you predict 12 in the future.
And the thing that's different about this LSU team to me, where most of the time LSU's going to go 8-4, 9-3. The thing that makes me feel differently about this season is the amount of upperclassmen coming back on the team. Most of the time, LSU does have 7 guys going to draft or something like that, and a couple other guys graduate. But this time they've got maybe 16 guys coming back, and 14 of them are seniors and seniors and juniors. So, I think that continuity, the offensive coordinators coming back and, got the same defensive coaches and everything, nobody left.
Right. There's a senior at every level, pretty much every unit, offensively and defensively for LSU's got a senior. So that.
So for me, looking at last year, they're swapping Vanderbilt for Georgia from last year. And I know Georgia was a win last year, but in terms of just overall schedule and wear and tear, I think that's a big positive. And really, they had that Texas A&M game won. So if you think about the weird game in Florida that just didn't go their way, if you turn that into a win and you accept that the A&M game was basically won, if it not for that freak knee down situation, that's an 11-1 team last year. And I do think, like Lamar, you said until you're proven otherwise, Alabama's going to beat LSU. Until I see it otherwise, Dave Aranda's going to field a top 3 defense at LSU, a top 5 defense at worst at LSU. So I do have my concerns about the running game, but overall, I think that they're lacking in some places. They're lacking the superstars, but in aggregate, I think LSU is just greater than the sum of its parts this year. So give me 11-1, and I'm not picking which one yet. I'm just not. I do think, tip in my hand, I think they beat Texas 2 weeks in. But yeah, give me 11-1. Josh, Lamar, y'all got anything else on this one?
Well, just because you guys both picked favorably on LSU, 11-1 and 10-2, I'm expecting 9-3 or 8-4.
Yeah, if y'all use our picks to put money on it, use them on a Bama pick or an Auburn pick, and not necessarily on how we pick LSU. But at least we're being positive here, and I don't know if we're trying to work some reverse juju situation, but I think we're both
we're going to be accused of it.
We're both pretty high on LSU this year. Josh, you got anything else?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think at the end of the day, LSU is a supremely talented team. If I had one thing to finish with, it would be I don't quite get the ranking even being where it is. To me, this is, at least on paper, it's a premier team in college football this season. And again, that the return of Chason is a massive deal because it was a major hole in the team last year. If I were to point out one thing, though, that will be a big deal is you've got guys like Shelvin and Chason and, maybe Sullivan. We'll see how he flips in at tight end. Emery, a lot of guys that Stingley, right? Guys that haven't played much football, and we've got a lot of assumptions on how good they're going to be. Most of it you would assume would be true based off everything we've heard in the offseason. That's why we don't like to get too much in the nitty-gritty. But there is a lot of uncertainty with LSU at a lot of different positions. And again, going back to my depth point, some of those they have replacements, but some of them, let's say if Chason doesn't produce at the level we expect, there's not necessarily something to step into it. And that it's going to create a lot of volatility and uncertainty, which is probably why we end up being completely wrong.
That's Josh for you. When he says he doesn't have anything else, he gives us a good bit something else. All right, y'all, that's our LSU preview. Certainly look for us coming right back around once season starts to talk about that Texas game. If you haven't already, you should have, because I already reminded you to. Please subscribe, give us a like, and more importantly than all of that, let us know in the comments what you think LSU is going to do this year. And thanks again to our co-host this time around, Lamar Stevens. Thanks, y'all, for watching. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.